Hospital Porter's pride and dignity, stop the New World Order. Welcome to her Panwo TV, and this is another book review. Yes, it's a book, you've seen this on the video before because I did show it to you. I think it was on one of my Great Escape films. It's this particular book here. Yes, I Want to Believe, Posadism, UFOs and Apocalypse Communism by A.M. Gitlitz. According to Kim Stanley Robinson, Gitlitz, G-I-T-T-L-I-T-Z, strange name, shows how explosions of black political humour also contain utopian hopes very necessary to keep alive. As an advocate of partially automated adequate socialism, PAAS, what's that? I can only agree and applaud this fine book. Now, I'm a big fan of this author, Kim Stanley Robinson, sci-fi author, but anyway, there's a few other, I won't read all these particular, critics on the back of critics and these little quotes on the back of the book. As you know, I did put one on my book because it was from Steve Maurer on Roswell Rising. He gave it 5 stars, and I did put a quote on the back of that because he said it was really good. But this is actually, this is a book. This tells the story of a very strange chap. Now, I first heard about this story. It was actually Tony Topping. Tony Topping, on his radio show, he interviewed George Galloway, a famous British firebrand politician. And I first heard about this story and I thought, what? And I started looking into it, and what I discovered from looking into the story that I'm going to talk about, what's in this book, is I think it's one of the weirdest stories in all of ufology. And that's really saying something, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, UFOs, I think, tell us an awful lot about ourselves, the way we interact with them. UFOs themselves are an object, they're an objective fact. I know I don't go along with the Jungian idea that they're simply a projection of our consciousness and all this sort of thing, although that could be true in some cases. Generally speaking, I say they're an objective fact, and how we deal with them, I think, says an awful lot about us as much as it does about them. So ufology, I think, teaches humans about ourselves as well as what we learn about the aliens and their craft and whatever else there might be. And this generates an awful lot of eccentrics, an awful lot of very, very odd people. And the person who's the subject of this particular book is one of the strangest of all. Chap called Homero Romulo Cristalli, and we know him as J. Posadas. At least that's... Funnily enough, not many people in ufology really have talked about this. There was an article in Fortean Times about it years ago, a long time ago, in the early 2000s. Generally speaking, this is not talked about much in ufology. Now, if you Google the name of this book and its author, there's lots of interviews with him, which tend to be from things such as the Pluto Press, which is the publisher, I believe. Yeah, Pluto Press. Also, I think Zero Books have one, Novara Media have one. It's the kind of left-wing bread tube type people who tend to have interviewed the author about this book. And I thought I'd put a couple of comments on there because, you know, the political left have interviewed Gitlitz, and they're the ones who've been reviewing this book. I mean, all the other... See, let's have a look at the other authors. It's Mackenzie Walk, Mackenzie Walk is another critic, author of Capital is Dead. And David Broder, author of First They Took Rome. I think these are sort of left-wing type people. You know, I remember I talked about China Meerville. It's interesting talking about China Meerville because I think he's relevant to this story. But anyway, it's interesting that I thought someone ought to review this book and deal with this book and its subject from the ufological side. As you know, UFOs tend to be a load of fascist reactionaries, aren't we? At least that's what they call us. So how will we respond to all this? And so I thought, well, why don't I do it? I actually wrote an article in my column in UFO Truth magazine, actually. It's worth checking out, which this video is partly based on, although I do explore other areas. And I go into the details of basically what I'm going to talk about today in there. What's interesting about J. Posadas is that this Homero Romulo Cristalli is that of all the eccentrics that ufology throws up, and goodness knows there's a lot of those, I'm one of them, he alone existed and continued to exist and did not give up, being part of a community that completely denies UFOs as a phenomenon, the phenomenon of UFOs. Doesn't just laugh at them, ridicule them, it denies them even as a concept. It's something that goes beyond. It goes beyond just the usual dismissal. It just says you just don't even think about it. And because he was a part of that community, and the fact that Posadas actually maintained his interest in this is truly remarkable. It shows he was a truly unusual individual, very unusual individual indeed, quite remarkable. But to understand him better, we have to explore his life. He was born in 1912 in Argentina into a very, very poor family. He lived in extreme poverty. I mean, he talks about how one day the whole family had to eat they had a bunch of bananas to eat all week. I mean, you know, my grandmother used to tell me similar stories, not quite that bad, but my grandmother used to tell me things like she had one pair of shoes per year, and if they broke she had to just sew them up and plug the holes in the soles with chewing gum and things like that. I mean, honestly, I mean, people these days, really, based on the stories of older people, I would say that poverty today, generally, I can't speak for every single country in the world, but certainly in Britain, is far less extreme than it used to be. But he lived in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, the capital, big city, huge city, in this sprawling metropolis in Argentina, and he did like all South Americans, he was football mad, and he actually, to begin with, it looked like he might have a promising career as a professional footballer. He could have become the kind of Pele or Diego Maradona of his time, and it never worked out. It never worked out. But so he went to work in a shoe factory. He was a cobbler, and he started a trade union, and he joined several other trade unions, and he got very much into trade unionism. Now, it's interesting because this is something that I did, and I think there's an element in which my own early life and Posadas's converges. Now, after that, it's really weird, because after that in one way we went in a completely different direction. In another way, we kind of joined up together. We sort of went off in another direction and kind of joined up later on. But at the same time, we're completely in the other direction. It's like a weird kind of combination of divergence and convergence between my life and Posadas's. He joined the trade union to improve his standard of living, because he believed that the path to an improved life, a better world, lay through trade unionism. And I myself thought this when I was 18 or so, when I first started at the hospital. I actually abandoned that idea very quickly. I saw through it, shall we say. I mean, those who stayed in there would say, oh, he went crazy, but I believe I saw through it. And he got into Marxism. I mean, Marxism is an enticing lure for people of all kinds, and for him it was pretty clear. He started reading up on Marx and Engels. Now Marxism was invented by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 1840s. Because the 1840s was a very turbulent decade. There were revolutions breaking out all over the place, and these two guys got together. They were both Germans, but they were living in London, and to try to work out exactly why this was happening. And their conclusion was it was the battle between rich and poor. It was class struggle. And they published this thing called the Communist Manifesto. It was 1848, I believe, which I've read, actually. It's a short book. You can actually read it. You can read it in an hour or two. I read it as research from the Roswell trilogy, because, as you know, this subject does come up in the Roswell trilogy. Funnily enough, I invented a character in that particular story, which is strangely similar to Posadas in one way in particular, not in the ufological sense, but in another way. So the Marx and Engels, you see, they went on to do more work, and they came up with a very brazen idea. They claimed, with no lack of modesty, to have solved the solution to all human interaction, all human history and society. They believed that they had worked it all out. I know, it's you must admit, you must admire the balls, I'll tell you, for saying something like that. But they said it was all down to class struggle. Everything was to do with class struggle, whether it was slaves versus slave owners, whether it was whether it was peasants versus the lords in the medieval time, feudalism, or whether it was the proletariat, the working class, versus the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, in the industrial era, in the capitalist era. And see, he so for Cristalli, it was obvious what was happening for him. He believed, now I don't share this view myself, but he believed the reason he was poor and all his fellow cobblers were poor and everyone around him in Buenos Aires was poor, apart from the rich people, was because basically those rich people, the owners of the industries, the owners of the means, the people who owned privately the means of production, were appropriating the value of his labour. I mean, you hear a lot about appropriation these days. It's usually cultural appropriation and things like that, but in this case it was like literally taking capital from the person who actually does the work to earn it, and taking it from them and keeping it. Through the eyes of the Marxists, it's a form of theft, and that is the basis of capitalism for him. And the solution was for the workers to reverse that process by taking control of those industries themselves and running them via their own management system, what in Russia was called the Soviets, the Soviets, and that was known as the Socialist Revolution. And they were inspired indeed by the revolution which broke out in Russia when Posadas was a child, and inspired many people around the world through the 1920s and 1930s and beyond. Of course, I'm talking about the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Now, Cristalli, he joined many organisations. One of the ones he joined was the Revolutionary Socialist Party of Argentina, and that's when he started writing articles for their journal under the name J. Posadas, and it was just like a pen name, but it stuck in the end. So he decided to continue calling himself J. Posadas. Yeah, and then so he basically campaigned, he wrote, he went to meetings, he leafleted, put posters up, a bit like the way trade unions do these days. So now what happened was, I suppose from the very start, J. Posadas, I think this may have led him into what he became, because he was an oddity from the very start. Because you see, the 20th century was pretty much a history of, in terms of Marxism, was a history of splits and conflicts. Today there is no complete definitive story of Marxism. Ever since Marx and Engels died, their protégés have clashed bitterly over what their masters meant. Their masters and teachers, what did they mean, the founders of the faith? And this has led to several real Monty Python style Judean People's Front of Judea type things. In fact, that particular scene in the Monty Python movie satirises this whole this sectarianism which came about. It's actually he was part of this split. I mean, there was this split between different people, different groups ever since the Russian Revolution. For example, there was the Third International, which includes all the communist parties that broke out everywhere. But then the Fourth International emerged, which was basically followers of a dissident. There was a dissident. He was the snowball character in George Orwell's Animal Farm, and his name was Leon Trotsky. Now, he was like a second in command of Lenin during the Bolshevik Revolution. He led the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and he eventually fell out of favour. There was a Joseph Stalin came to power when Lenin died, and Trotsky was basically he had to flee Russia. He never went back to Russia. If he had done, he'd have been killed. In fact, he was killed in absentia. He was convicted in absentia of treason and was killed. What happened was he was tracked down to his hideout in Mexico City in 1940, and basically one of Stalin's agents killed him. Hacked him to death with an ice pick. So yeah, this was the world that Posadas was growing up in, or developing in terms of his political education. He was developing as a young man into middle age in a world in which Marxism itself had deeper and wider divisions, and that he was on one side. He was on the side of the Fourth International. Now, what this means, I think, is one moment. the reason I think this is significant, and this actually comes up in Gitlitz, actually brings it up in the book, is that probably from the very early stage he was familiar with heresy. He was comfortable with the idea that he had unconventional and intolerable thoughts and opinions, even among his fellow Marxists. So from the very earliest times he got involved with Fourth International, he was probably continuously arguing with people in the Third International and other groups. There's the Maoists and the Titoists, and there's so many of them. And there's the People's Popular Front of Judea. He's over there. Splitter! He would have these kinds of arguments that are satirised so well and so hilariously by the Monty Python team. He would actually get involved in these. So he was accustomed, I think, to being regarded as an outcast, which I think was very important to where he was going with his life, because he was also a very big fan of cosmism. Now, cosmism is a genre of literature, primarily. It's also an idea of a series of, it's also philosophy, but in terms of science and politics, but it's primarily a genre of fiction which was popular in Russia from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And there was, for example, there was what's his name, Alexander Bogdanov wrote a book called Red Star. I think that's the most popular one of the cosmist canon. But there was lots of other authors as well. There was Nikolai Chernyshevsky. He wrote a book called What Is to Be Done. That inspired Lenin. So I mean, a lot of the Bolsheviks were actually into cosmism as well. But I mean, China Miéville mentions that. Do you remember my Apocalypse video where I bring this up? Because China Miéville mentions Chernyshevsky and the row of dots. You do watch. Maybe I'll put a link in the description box to my Apocalypse video. Will I remember to do that? Why haven't I got my pen with me? Oh well, what the hell. So this idea of being an outcast and being an independent thinker, which you'd have to have been from day one, plus the fact that he was into this cosmos literature. Now, the basis of cosmos literature is I'm going to have to get my pen. I hate it when I do this, but I just get kind of... Oh, I get kind of this idea. I've got to remember something. I think I'll remember that. But then I think, no, I better write it down. So where are we? Okay, I'll write it on my hand here. Okay. Apocalypse. Write it on my arm. There we are. So I'll know to add it to the comments section, to the description box of this video. What it was with cosmism. Cosmism tended to be kind of utopian fiction, set in a kind of affected, what was it China Miéville said? An affected future paradise. So it would often be set in the future. There's futuristic scenes, often in kind of post-socialist idylls. Very often it was other planets. Now a lot of Cosmos was also science fiction. It involved stories of space travel, landing on other planets. Very often it was Mars or Venus, of which people knew nothing about at the time. They didn't realise what they were like, in terms of Mars being cold and dry and Venus being hot and stuffy and full of acid. No one knew that at the time. And there would be aliens there who lived in a kind of communist utopia, and these would be described in great detail. And people found them inspiring. People read them and they found them inspiring. I mean, there's actually an author called William Morris, an Englishman actually. I suppose you could call him a British cosmist. He wrote a book called News from Nowhere, which is very interesting to read. That was in the 1890s he wrote that, which is a kind of British cosmism. It's the closest a British author's got to cosmism. So, if you combine these things, being an outcast, interesting cosmism, you can just imagine that Posadas would have looked at the sky and wondered. And there was just one more ingredient needed for Posadas to become what he was. Now, the 1940s were a tough time for the Fourth International, because Trotsky was murdered. In 1940, he was at his hideout in Mexico City. Today it's the Leon Trotsky Museum, actually. And someone sneaked into his office and killed him, beat him over the head with an ice axe like mountaineers use, which hacked him to death. And that was a big blow. Now it's obvious that Stalin had sent the KGB, the assassins of the KGB, out to kill everyone they could find. So this was a kind of like Sergei Skripal thing, plus 100. Well, all Sergei Skripal's fake. I know Nick Colliston talks about that, but you know what I mean. So he was kind of like a bit down in the dumps. Posadas was down in the dumps. And one day he was sitting in. He went to various places where there was these called like socialist cafes, and they had newspapers, and one was called La Razón. One of these newspapers in Argentina was called La Razón. And one day in 1947 he was reading it, and he saw some amazing articles. One was about the Kenneth Arnold encounter in June of that year, and he read that very eagerly. About this is where flying saucers first came into his understanding. And then he heard about Roswell. I mean, Roswell, of course, Roswell kind of ended in a nothing burger after a couple of days of complete hysteria. But of course, it wasn't a nothing burger, as we found out 31 years later when Jesse met Stan. Posadas heard about these things and was enthralled, and he started talking about them, because at the same time, you see, the world was buzzing. UFOs, everyone was UFO crazy. The whole world was buzzing about them. This was before the term UFO had emerged. People just called them flying saucers. But the whole world was flying saucer nuts at that time. There was a craze, a global flap. And Argentina was no exception. There was a large object that looked like a red cloud was seen over Cordoba, and what was described as flying rings of fire appeared at Balcacre. And he used to sit there. Posadas used to sit around with the members of his branch, including his psychic Dante Minazzoli, and talk about UFOs. And they say, "What's all this about in this one branch of the party? Let's talk about UFOs. What does it mean?" And apparently a memo came through from head office telling them not to talk about this. As I said, it's not just something to laugh at. It's a non-concept. It's something you're not even allowed to think about if you're a communist. The thing about Marxists is they are obsessive materialists. There's a large crossover, actually, between Marxism and the skeptic movement. People like Jamie Ian Swiss is just one example of that. There's many, many others. In fact, there's a big battle, the big battle going on, skeptics at the moment, between the Atheism Plus people and the Sargonites and people like that. It comes out of that, because the Atheism Plus people are basically neo-Marxist kind of SJWs. But that's a story I cover in another video. Now, in 1951, this didn't shut him up. Minazzoli and Posadas kept talking about this, and they kept talking about in their branch, to the point where in 1951 there was a massive split in the Fourth International, and he went his own way. J. Posadas formed a second group and split from the Fourth International. I think what was it called? It was called the International... what was it called? It was called the Intergalactic Workers' League. That's it. International Workers' League. Someone's called the Intergalactic Workers' League. Posadist. The word Posadist was in brackets, but they split from the Fourth International. There were several other names they called themselves. There was the Workers' Revolutionary Party Trotskyist. Well, there's actually a branch of that in England, actually, which is Posadist in nature. Because Posadists call themselves Trotskyists. There's loads of others. There's too many here. This is the list of different. These are the list of different organisations that Posadas was in some way associated with. It's a huge amount. And you can see where this is going here, because you have this interest in cosmos literature, this utopian fantasy future worlds and alien worlds that were described, plus the fact that he and his group were used to getting into arguments with others and rejecting and thinking in ways that were skeptical, in the true meaning of the word, with a small c, with a c, of other people within Marxism, plus UFOs and the reports about alien spaceships supposedly flying through our atmosphere and landing. You can see where he's going with this, can't you? it can lead only to one conclusion: that the UFOs were socialists. The fact that they built these craft, they were sophisticated civilization with the ability to travel long distances in space, meant, according to Posadas and people like him, that they must have overcome the limitations of capitalism and moved into a post-capitalist future, as envisaged by China Miéville. China Miéville refuses to write about it, like he said, and describe it. Posadas was only too eager to. And he believed that the aliens on their planets had already been through that socialist revolution. And the fact they were coming to Earth, what did it mean? They were our liberators. They were the liberators of planet Earth. And he said this is, you can get this on Marxist.org actually. This is the Marxist, it's an online archive of Marxist thought. We must appeal to the beings on other planets when they come here to intervene and collaborate with Earth's inhabitants in suppressing poverty. We must unite with them, they who seem more powerful than human beings, so they will come here and help us resolve Earth's problems, resolve problems of humanity on Earth. And this is the thing, I mean, he was looking around himself and seeing all these problems that he blamed on capitalism and thinking, well, if we can't overthrow capitalism ourselves, because Trotsky predicted that capitalism would end after World War II. Well, World War II ended and it still carried on. So obviously the workers' revolutionary movement was deficient in some way. Well, if his idea was that if we're incapable of doing this, obviously the aliens have seen us and they're coming to intervene, they're coming to help us out. They're saying, look, we can't, they've done their best, man, let's just give them a helping hand. And so he for one welcomed our alien overlords. Now, that was an idea he stuck with. I mean, he had many other ideas, which I'll come to in a minute, which are described later on in this book by A.M. Gitlitz. He believed in I'll come on to the stuff about nuclear war at the end and dolphins, but he died in 1981 after Posadas. He was actually in Italy when he died. He went back to his ancestral homeland. I mean, his parents had been Italian. He was born and grew up in Argentina, but he did go back to Italy. I think he got in touch with some of his family, and he formed a group there. He died in 1981. And he left behind, I mean, he was pretty much denounced by other leftists, and indeed they still denounce him, most of them today. But he left behind a small but dedicated group of followers. Scorned, laughed at. I mean, I was watching a documentary actually called Labour, the Wilderness Years, which is about basically the Labour Party between 1979 and 1997, basically between the election of Margaret Thatcher and the election of Tony Blair. This is called the Wilderness Years, when they just couldn't win anything. And you had old Dennis Healy was interviewed, and he was laughing at the Posadists. He said, oh, the Posadists turned up, these people who believe in aliens. And it's funny, you know, it's weird that they do joke about it. I mean, George Galloway, when he did his interview with Tony Topping, I think he saw it as a bit of a joke as well. I think he mentioned it to Tony because he knows Tony's into aliens and things like that. So he left. So the Posadists continued without him. I mean, Dante Minnesoli ran it for a while. There's a chapter here about Dante Minnesoli being the leader. Which chapter is it? Oh, so there's here we go. I don't know. I can't find all this. Here we are. But there's part 1, the Tragic Century, part 2, the Posadas Fourth International, stuff like that. But Minnesoli took over, and I don't know what happened to him. I don't know. He must be dead now, I think. I didn't check, but he was kind of forgotten by most people and laughed at by most of the people who remembered him. Funny enough, though, in 2016, he kind of made a bit of a comeback on social media. There was a bit of a social media craze about him. He was set up. There was where is it here? Here we go. There was these. This is a little page of the various things. Just have a look at that. That's funny, that, isn't it? Who says the left can't meme, eh? Yeah, these various memes appeared. There's one like. You take the blue pill, the story ends. He's dressed up like, there's Posadas here, dressed up like Morpheus. You take the gently glowing green pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. You know, and there's Posadism, transhumanism, the terrestrial. It's all kinds of jokes like that. There's a kind of Pepe-like figure there, you see. And this one, damn bitch, you live like this, an alien. This all came out around about it started in 2016. It's still going on today. There are several Posadist Facebook groups which are not actually political. They're just dedicated to satire and humour related to Posadism. And it's run by someone called Comrade Commander. And I don't know who that is, but he's someone basically who keeps this meme culture alive. So it's interesting actually looking at Posadism and comparing it to, you see, various other connections to ufology. As I said, you can learn an awful lot more. You can learn a lot more about humanity through this study than you can about the extraterrestrials. I mean, I'm interested in UFO religions. I don't believe in any UFO. See, there's various UFO or semi-UFO themed religions. There's the Raelians, of course. There's the Aetherius Society. There's Heaven's Gate, which of course there's a tragic story behind that, because there was actually a mass suicide associated with Heaven's Gate at one point in the 90s. And there's several others that address UFOs as part of their theology, such as the Nation of Islam, who are absolutely crazy and absolutely insane people. Louis Farrakhan, if you remember, Louis Farrakhan turned up at the Citizen hearing in 2013. I got annoyed by that actually, because that woman on the panel, she called a halt to proceedings to say, "Oh, Minister Farrakhan is here. How wonderful!" Louis Farrakhan is actually a racist scumbag, and he's also completely batshit crazy. I mean, he thinks Tom Jones is a black man. But what's funny about Farrakhan is he also believes that UFOs are angelic beings sent down from God. He calls them wheels of light. Wheels of light! Which is really hilarious. But the thing is, it's weird actually, because according to these various religions or semi-religions related to UFOs, the ETs are like godlike super beings, and they come to they're kind of saviors. I mean, they're saviors who've come down from the sky, and they're sort of infused with spiritual power from various god or something else, or super being, creator of the universe. And they've come to Earth to save us, to teach us spiritual messages. Now, what's weird about that is it's definitely equivalent. I mean, it's the only difference between that and Posadism is the spiritual message. I mean, J. Posadas was a Marxist, therefore he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God or any kind of divinity. But if you listen to what he says about UFOs and their role in possibly helping us out on Earth, helping alleviate situations on Earth, and you listen to the Raelians and the Aetherius Society and the Nation of Islam and these other people talking about UFOs, there's that Marshall Vians as well. I know a lady actually who's very into the Marshall Vian person. I don't know much about it. I've read a bit of the book she gave me, but so Lorraine, if you're watching, I have read a bit of that book. It's interesting. What's interesting about the whole thing is, even though these two things are very different in form, the idea of a spiritual divinity working through aliens to come and save us, and the idea that aliens are basically communists and they've come here to impose a socialist government on the world to save humanity and save the planet. Those two things are very different in form, but they're strangely equivalent in a curious way. I mean, I cover that a bit in my Apocalypse video, which I will remember to put a link in the description box to. I've written it on my arm now, so I can't forget. But there's one factor that's missing here in this dialogue. Can you work out what it is? It's the aliens themselves. It's the ETs. Have you ever, I've never heard of this, have you ever heard any story about an alien coming down to Earth, stepping out of his spaceship and introducing himself as an intergalactic communist? I haven't, personally, I haven't. Now, there are reports of aliens... Hang on one sec. So my screensaver kicks in. The light from my monitor is part of my lighting system here, so every time the screensaver kicks in, I just go and I waggle the mouse to stop it. There are reports of extraterrestrials affiliating themselves with various movements here on Earth in terms of religions or spiritual or sometimes political messages. Sometimes they have political, economic, sociological and religious spiritual messages. However, in terms of these UFO religions, in terms of evidence, they tend to be very weak, and they tend to come from people who are existing believers in that particular religion. So, for example, Claude, what's his name? Claude Vollillon. I can't speak French. I used to learn French at school. It sounds like a donkey brain, doesn't it? Claude Vollillon. Apologies to my French listeners, viewers. Apologies to my French viewers, but Claude Vollillon, he's the founder of the Raelianism, and today he's called His Holiness Rael, as the leader of this movement. Now, he founded the religion after he supposedly had a close encounter. He was having a walk in the hills in central France, and basically a spaceship landed in front of him, and this alien, this sweet, lovely, smiling, benign alien stepped out of the spaceship and approached him. And this alien said it was called Yahweh Elohim, which are words from the Bible. They're two words from the Bible. And the rest is history. Now, there are more convincing ET contact studies, most of them done by people like Mary Rodwell. I find her very interesting, that do involve communications about purpose. As I said, aliens do sometimes, and there's more convincing reports in terms of people describing contact experiences, where aliens sometimes do mention their purpose here on Earth. And they very often have messages, very often about environmentalism and war and things like that. They're often very concerned about. I think maybe that's to do with the fact that it was when the nuclear bomb was invented. That's when UFOs really started to come about more often, which there could be some truth behind what Posadas is saying. Not that these guys are really intergalactic communists, but they do seem to have looked at us, and as the late great Jim Mars said, oh my God, the kids have found the matches, and they have been taking an interest in us for that reason. So it's possible that's where Posadas was going with this, and he filtered it through the lens of his own worldview. But he may have been kind of correct in a way. So these more convincing studies, not the Voyons and people like that, but the more convincing people who are not believers in any religion or UFO religion, they just have these contact experiences. Sometimes the UFOs, the aliens, will actually talk to them about their purpose here on Earth. But the thing about it is, those messages vary. The message you hear vary very much. They vary a lot. It appears that the aliens actually have a lot of... They have a lot of different agendas. There's no one message from the aliens. The aliens are all kinds of different species. I mean, that fits with the different kind of beings you see. There's virtually a taxonomy of different sized greys and different colour greys, and the reptilians and the mantids and the Nordics and things like that. And the spacecraft they fly in are often very different in design. It's clear they have a number of different origins, and their purpose is, the reason they've come to Earth is different. And they say different things. So there's no one alien agenda from one type of alien and from one place. And so it's like, it's not actually possible to know what they're on about. It's not possible, I think, to make the kind of assumptions that J. Posadas made. And indeed, a lot of other people who tend to put words in the aliens' mouths. It's possible that increased contact, in a post-disclosure world, there may be increased human-alien contact, and maybe we'll learn more about what the various aliens want with us. It's weird, you know. I covered this. I'll put a link to the Molyneux video. Apocalypse. Apocalypse Molyneux. My UFO Stefan Molyneux video, right? My reply to Stefan Molyneux about UFOs. I think it was the first one. I'll put both in there just in case. I'm not going to bother reading through them. There, it's on my arm. Can you see that there? Yeah. He said basically that the aliens who came to visit Earth, they had to be from a libertarian capitalist society. So they had to be laissez-faire capitalists to have built. It's really weird. It's for the exact same reason. For the exact same reason as Posadas. He thought the aliens had to be libertarian capitalists. They had to be at the opposite end of the political spectrum. For the same reason that Posadas thought they were on the far left of the spectrum. Because he said only a libertarian capitalist society could create something like intergalactic space travel. That's Stefan Molyneux. He said it actually as part of a joke. He wasn't really serious. But you know, we can't keep making these assumptions. We can't keep... I think sometimes people's imagination when it comes to UFOs, not so much within the UFO community, with people on the fringes of it who are attached to some kind of belief system associated with it, like J. Posadas, they tend to tend to let their imaginations run wild, and they overreach with the conclusions they make about the aliens. They just go too far. We're dealing with something that is so different from us. It's rather like the film Arrival, which is very, very good. It's the best alien invasion film of all, because the film, you don't really get to talk to the aliens, because the film is all about simply working out how to talk to the aliens, deciphering their language, developing some kind of communication system. We're dealing... You can't make it a comparison between human society and alien society any more than you can make a comparison between an anthill and a penguin colony. And maybe even more than that, because at least ants and penguins evolved on the same planet. It may be even worse than that. I think all we can do is not overreach. Let's not jump to conclusions, especially ones which are very, very clearly based on ourselves, on our own imaginations rather than what we can see. When it comes to aliens, I think all we can do is go with the available evidence, and that's what ufology is about for me. Therefore, I don't consider J. Posadas really a ufologist. He was an interesting chap. He was a maverick. If I'd met him, I don't know if I'd have got on with him. I mean, the thing about Posadas is he ended up running what could only be described as some kind of cult. I mean, towards the end of his life, he was living in Italy. Now, he set up some kind of commune in a part of Italy. It was, which was a little bit weird. Neo-Posadism. Hang on, it's. He fell ill at the end. It's just before he died, but he came up with some really odd, weird ideas. For example, he thought that babies ought to be. He had more than one wife or woman in his life. Now that again is a sign of a. You see, it's a sign of a cult leader. I mean, the Posadism eventually. I mean, it's not today. If you go to the Posadas website today, it's different. But in the 70s in Italy, Posadism became morphed into some kind of weird cult, where he kind of had a harem of different women, and he was like a kind of Jim Jones like character almost, and he came up with some weird ideas. For example, he adopted the dolphin as a central symbol of unity, and he started reading Peter Lilly, the guy who was involved with SETI, because Posadas was very interested in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which I cover in another video, which I might or might. I'll put a bloody link in the description box to that. Oh right, I will. I've dropped my pen. I'll remember. I've dropped my notes. He knew Peter Lilly and talked to Peter Lilly, this Australian guy, who theorised that dolphins were super intelligent. And I actually did a video about that with Stefan Molyneux, which I'll put. Do I have to put a link in the description box to that as well? No, I won't. I'll just put SETI. He said that babies should be born in birthing pools in which dolphins were there, and the dolphins would act like a midwife. So there was something a little bit new age about Posadas in the 70s and the group he formed. It really was. It was a very strange thing, because he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old man, you know. And he was a bit of a dirty old But these women seem to like go for him. I mean, a lot of the photographs actually were taken of him were taken in that period of his life when he was like, when he was getting old. But the girls loved him. But he had like he ran this sort of cult, and then this was Dante Minnezzoli was involved as well, because he was still second in command. Like I say, he took over when Posadas died, and I think that's when things calmed down a little bit. Because to the end of his life, Posadas he went a bit crazy, to everyone's acknowledgement at the end of his life. He also had said something else very weird. Now, what's funny enough, this comes up in the Roswell trilogy. I had no idea about Posadas' views. I hadn't even heard of any. I only knew the basics about J. Posadas when I actually wrote Roswell Redeemed, my most recent novel. But in that book, you'll know there's a character in it who's a Marxist who believes that the socialist revolution can be brought about by nuclear war. And then I look into Posadas. I read this book and I found out that Posadas believed the same thing. He said that nuclear holocaust was a good thing because it would completely demolish the entire capitalist structure of the earth, and the result of that would be that the people who survive it, assuming there were survivors, could then build the socialist revolution out of the ruin. So you basically rather than taking over the factories and things like that, you just knock them down and build new factories. That was his attitude, and he applied that to all of society. So he knew that nuclear war would kill almost everyone on Earth, but the people surviving would be able to build socialism out of that, and therefore communism, and the world could continue. So he actually believed that nuclear war was a good thing. And of course that scandalised him from many, many other people. So lots of weird ideas, didn't he? Lots of weird guys. Now, let's have page one. I've got one more thing in my notes here. Page 171. I just made notes as I was going along through reading this book. Bob Lazar debunked, and what's this? This is interesting. Oh, this is right. Minnezzoli. What happened to Minnezzoli? Perhaps in this lie, Minnezzoli wrote. Minnezzoli believed in it, an example of this enemy alien propaganda could be seen in the shift of narratives concerning aliens between the 50s and the 60s. In the first UFO wave following Roswell, anthropologist Stephen Mizrak wrote, contactees claimed that the Space Brothers, their name for the aliens, had come here to warn mankind of the interplanetary dangers of nuclear war. They were here like benevolent overlords to save us from ourselves. A decade later, as science fiction films and tabloids began to portray aliens like Russian invaders, abduction reports take on a less fantabulous, more horror movie-like narrative where entities no longer seem to be eager to tell us all why we're here, Space Brothers. Well, that's interesting. He said that because this was an anthropologist saying this about, not a ufologist who believes that they're real. However, it's funny that there are different kinds of contact. The kind of like the Adamski types, the tall whites and things like that. You still get them today, but you see, you also got like the horror-like abductions. Not the Travis Walton one. You know, the ones where you get like probed and things like that. They do happen, but they did happen before. So, like many skeptics claim things about the UFO phenomenon, as they say, are based on society, when in fact very often it's the other way around. As we saw with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Brian Dunning thought no one saw grey aliens before 1977, when Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released. But then Robbie Graham managed to track down the production designer of that film and said, "Where did you get the idea for those aliens?" And he said, "Oh, I phoned up one of the people who sees them." So Dunning put the cart before the horse there. And in fact, if you go to I was just talking to someone about cave paintings. Actually, someone just sent me some information about cave paintings, and I'd already heard about this, but it was nice they sent me some more. You get cave paintings in prehistoric times with grey aliens. You get them in Australia, everyone. They call them the Wanginas. Yeah. Perhaps in this lie, this is Minnezzoli. Perhaps in this lie Minnezzoli wrote of propaganda against aliens, in these declarations and programs of false information, of intoxication, the same world bourgeoisie and the boss of that nightmare mafia, the United States, can fall in their own trap. in this information disinformation, maybe will be a partial truth. And that's the end of the quote. Something like this did occur in the 90s, with the release of disinformation from the now debunked figures like Bob Lazar spurred an activist movement among ufologists demanding disclosure, a radical transparency into what the government knows. Its most prominent figure was the Canadian ufologist Stanton Friedman, who called for the continued classification of government UFO research a cosmic Watergate, and gave hundreds of university and bookshop lectures, I've been to a few of them, instructing the UFO curious to distrust the government and the military. Well, I think that's perfect. Obviously, A.M. Gitlitz is writing that in the sense that, oh, it's all a load of fancy, it's all a load of nonsense, and that this debunked, so-called debunked Bob Lazar story is he just launched this silly disclosure movement, this exopolitics. For Minazoli, such campaigns were the heart of his mission, popularising the tension between believers and the global order among the working class, who have nothing to lose but the universe to gain. That's an adaptation of Karl Marx's, you know, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains and the world to win, and I think that was it, you know. Friedman was of course no Marxist, and the distrust he sowed arguably fueled conspiratorial, xenophobic right-wingers. People like me, in other words. Far more than socialists. In her recent investigation into the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, for her book Republic of Lies, journalist Anna Merlin discovered deference to whistleblowers, no matter how dubious their claims or regressive their agenda. Some were open white supremacists. Yeah. Thing is, you get called a white supremacist these days for saying white people are not evil. Just I don't know. I've never met a white supremacist who's any kind of whistleblower. Remain central to the field. Their pretenses of objective scientific inquiry. Pretenses of objective scientific inquiry. Steve Mumbling, I think you should read this. Were no match for the material incentives of peddling shocking and viral stories. Minazoli's book was an attempt to head off that familiar appropriation of libertarian sentiments for right populism. But it generally made little direct impact on the ufological community, and the few who appreciated the book or sympathised with his politics kept it a secret. After that, I should have gone into more about this, because Dante Minazoli had this strange idea that he could basically take over ufology. I remember this now. I'm making notes about it. I should have done at the time. But he had this strange idea that he could basically put his own people into the UFO movement. The overall flavour of Minazoli's entryism, that's entryism. He wanted to put his own people into the movement. Makes it tempting to understand the briefness of Posadas' public embrace of the thesis as a wide attempt to satire, satiate and redirect his energies towards terrestrial politics. Unless Ryan Sprague is one of them, I don't know. I know he leans left a bit, old Brian. I think he does. I think he's a bit of a pinko. He loves Joe Biden. I've got a feeling this guy supports Joe Biden. Anyway, I could go into more about that. It should be something. But maybe I should read Dante Minazoli's book and do a review of that. Perhaps that's the answer. But anyway, that was, for the time being, I've just read this. I Want to Believe, Posadism, UFOs and Apocalypse Communism by A.M. Gitlitz. As far as I know, I'm the first person on the UFO side of the debate to review this book. Lots of people on the leftist politics side of the debate have reviewed it. There's been lots of reviews of it in various left-wing journals. I think I'm the first ufologist to review the book, and that's quite an honour. So, yeah, groundbreaking Ben I am this time, definitely. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching this video. It's nice to get away from the bloody election for once and going on about it. It's getting depressing, actually, it really is. I will have to come back to it before next week, definitely, before the supposed inauguration of Joe Biden, should such an abomination happen. But in the meantime, thank you all of you for watching Hapanwo TV. Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity. Stop the New World Order.